How are you doing today, Marilyn?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
How's the weather out there in California?
It's a beautiful day and it's almost paradise. Nothing to complain about here.
Can you tell us about some of your research and what you do?
Well, I've had an interest in understanding consciousness and the powers and potentials of consciousness, really a long time, decades, and have had the opportunity to explore different perspectives, angles, dimensions of consciousness. One area that I've been interested in is, what is the essence of consciousness? Is it beyond the brain? Are there qualities of our consciousness that transcend physicality? These are some of the questions that I've been asking and, doing that in different kinds of research settings. One question is what happens to consciousness when we die? Where does it go? And in order to address that, I've interviewed scientists from different disciplines and perspectives, and I've also interviewed people who are mystics or spiritual teachers who have a particular philosophy or worldview around that. I made a feature-length documentary with Deepak Chopra called Death Makes Life Possible.
Mhm.
And there's also a book that's a companion that dives more deeply into the science and the different kind of worldviews or perspectives that people hold on that. So, I've looked at all kinds of perspectives. It's clear to me that there are multiple answers to the question of where our consciousness goes when we die. And maybe a lot of the answers have to do with what is our worldview now in this embodied form, and does that prime us to launch onto another trajectory after we cease to be in our bodies?
Well, what do you think of reincarnation? Do you think there's anything to that?
Reincarnation is a very widely held worldview or belief system. And, I've had the privilege of working with the people at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville around the reincarnation work that was initiated by Ian Stevenson.
Mhm.
Jim Tucker is one of the people that we interviewed for the film. And, they have systematically collected case studies of people who have experienced some sense of having been alive before in a different form, in a different personality. Reincarnation as a worldview implies that there is something um, consistent about our personality, about our identity. And so when we leave the physical, that identity moves into another form and can come back and incarnate in another body. One of the interesting things about the research that they're doing is, some of the amazing case studies of young children, for example, who have a memory of having been alive in a past life and who have some kind of birthmark or physical indicator that correlates with the previous life. So, for example, a scar on the skull that goes from, there's two scars, one in the front, one in the back. And when they did their research and investigated what this person may have died from, that this young child is remembering, they found that the person had been shot in the head and that there was a bullet that entered and exited. So that's a very interesting correlation. It's not definitive, it's not, super evidentiary, but it is provocative. And I think that when they have amassed all these various case studies, it begins to look like, a valid scientific kind of exploration of what is reincarnation.
Yeah, a friend of mine, Maria, she was on a Discovery Channel special with Jim Tucker. He interviewed her because her son would wake up and be screaming that I'm hurt, somebody shot me. And it turns out Maria's father was a policeman in New York City, and he was gunned down. He went into a 7-Eleven and there was a robbery going on, and he was shot in the back. And so her son, Ian, has a birthmark right at that spot where her father was shot. And her dad always said, I will always be with you, I'll always protect you. And So she believes that her son is indeed her father's spirit that came in to, watch over her as her son.
Well, the world is full of mysteries, and I do not easily discount things that have such meaning for people in their lives.
There's some driving force inside you, that curiosity and so forth. Where do you think that comes from? Was it when you were a little girl, or was it when you were a teenager? When did that start?
I would say it was a progression of life experiences. Maybe before I can even remember, when I was a precocious toddler, exploring the world in my cute pink jammies, and my father had inadvertently left a can of lighter fluid on the kitchen table. And I did what good little empiricists do. I took the bottle and I put it in my mouth. And that led to the intensive care, weeks in and out of, sort of that life and death situation. And I think, maybe I can't remember any of that. I was 18 months old, but maybe there were some seeds that were planted then where, I began to understand this kind of semi-permeable membrane between living and dying. And then when I was a kid, angry, rebellious. I grew up in Detroit, and it was a time of great discontent. And I was somewhere I shouldn't have been, with somebody I shouldn't have been with. Closing time of the bar, and we were hit by a drunk driver when I was on the back of a motorcycle. And in that moment, my leg was torn on the bumper of the car. My body was hurled into the air. And I distinctly remember watching my body tumbling. So that would be, an example of some kind of out of body experience that, to this day, I can even viscerally experience it. I feel it. And then I thudded and, landed on the concrete. And then from there, I went to the hospital, and they were talking about amputating my leg. They put 66 stitches in my left knee and then sent me home for a week to see what would happen. And I remember laying on the couch in my family's living room, and somehow, and I'm going to say this was a noetic kind of experience, something that came to me directly, I had the sense that if I could harness my imagination, that maybe I could heal myself. I could get my immune system working, and I wouldn't need to have my leg amputated. And so I would lay there and visualize my leg healing, and I could feel the tingles going up my leg. And, sure enough, I went to the hospital a week later, and, it wasn't a miraculous recovery, nothing like that, but I still have two very solid legs to stand on. So both of those stories suggest to me that there are powers and potentials of our consciousness, that our consciousness in the context of this out-of-body experience may transcend the physical, and that in the context of the healing, that we can bring our intentions to bear in ways that can help to alleviate suffering, that can help us in the process of healing, even our wound healing. So that has been probably a trigger for me for a long time, those personal experiences. And then, I started at Wayne State University in downtown Detroit, discovered two books that literally changed my life. The first was by Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And that book said to me that, we live in paradigms, and that those paradigms are not fixed or absolute, and that really for thousands of years, we have changed our models of reality. And I thought, wow, that's liberating. That means that the reality we're living in right now might not be the only way this game could be played. So that was an amazing experience. And I felt like I wanted to be a revolutionary. I wanted to shift our view of reality. And then I was working with a neurophysiologist at Wayne State Medical School, and he gave me a book called Psychic Exploration by the Apollo 14 astronaut, Edgar Mitchell.
Now, what year was this?
That would have been in like 1977.
Mm-hmm.
And shortly after the book was published, actually. And that set me on an odyssey. I wanted to be part of a paradigm shift. And I felt that consciousness and the potential extended reaches of consciousness, might be something that we could study, that we could understand, and that we could apply in order to make the world a better place. And that's literally been the journey I've been on ever since. Fast forward to some years later, without ever applying for the job, I ended up working at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, became the president, CEO, and all of that being, something that Edgar Mitchell had triggered and developed. And I somehow feel I was destined to be part of that program.
Absolutely. Edgar Mitchell, what happened to him on his way back from the moon?
Edgar's story is just so breathtaking. It's a beautiful, inspirational story about a person who grew up on a farm, Texas. His grandparents had come in a covered wagon across the country. His father was a farmer, and he went to the moon, and he was trained as an MIT engineer. He was in mission control when Apollo 13 was a near disaster. He helped to get those astronauts safely back to Earth. And he had the courage, after watching that near disaster, to get into the Apollo 14 capsule. And you can just imagine this tiny, rickety metal, box hurtling through space. And these courageous explorers, going up there and tackling that. And so Edgar's job was to man the little lunar module that went from the Apollo capsule to the moon and back. And so he was one of those handful of people who walked on the moon, had the perspective of seeing planet Earth from, deep space. But he describes the great moment as his return journey back to Earth. And I'm sure there was a release of effort. Most of his part of the mission was complete. He was successful. They were going home. And they entered what he called the barbecue rotation. So this is when the Apollo capsule was rotating in order that it didn't burst into flames on re-entry into the Earth's orbit. And so in that process of rotating, he got to experience the Earth, the sun, the moon, rising and setting, and rising and setting. And here he was in the vastness of space, and he got to see planet Earth from that vantage point. And it's kind of an image we take for granted now. We see the beautiful whole Earth, but it was really new, and it was a completely fresh perspective. And he had sort of two sensations, two epiphanies. The first was a painful experience, really, when he looked down at the beauty of planet Earth, and he didn't experience any divisions. There were no national boundaries, state boundaries, race boundaries, gender boundaries. None of that existed. What he saw was a perfect whole planet. And he realized that the great source of suffering that we experience on planet Earth isn't inherent in spaceship Earth, but really inherent in those of us who occupy this magical place. And so perhaps it is our consciousness and our worldviews that are the source of our suffering, and that could be the balm that could help us to heal the enormous ruptures. We can see today that we haven't made a lot of progress on that. The second aspect of his epiphany was this kind of unitive consciousness. He had been trained in Newtonian physics. It worked very well. It predicted, the spaceship's trajectory, got them to the moon, got them safely home. And it was this awareness that the molecules in his body and the molecules in the body of his co-astronauts were part of this extraordinary birthing of our universe and the Big Bang. And that there was really no separation, and that there was, in this sense, a fundamental interconnectedness between all of life and all of matter, and that we were one. So he had this kind of non-dual experience. He didn't know what to make of it. It didn't fit with anything he'd experienced before. It certainly didn't relate to his education and his upbringing. But when he came back to Earth, with the kind of largesse of being an astronaut, the fame, he started to explore, and he met with scientists, he met with spiritual adepts, and he came to think that it was what he called a samadhi experience, this kind of unitive merging with all that the great mystics describe. And that was when he decided to found the Institute of Noetic Sciences to bring together the rigor and discernment of science with then this kind of awesome experience of unity. And that's, that organization now is decades old and continues to do research. And Edgar has since transitioned. I don't know in what form, if any, but he was a great man, a beautiful person, and a beloved friend of mine.
That's awesome. What a nice story. What is your experience with remote viewing?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to me to watch that enterprise develop over time. When I first started in 77, I was working with a psychologist during the summer, an experimental psychologist at Wayne State University, and he gave me the book Mind Reach by Targan Puthoff. And he said, let's do some research on this. Let's play with this and see what it is. And that's what we did. We spent the summer kind of dabbling in remote viewing. He'd go out, I'd stay in and describe my experience. We'd reverse roles. And we were getting very striking correspondences. One day he went to a location, and I had this sensation of being like in an elevator going up and getting to the top and immediately turning around. Something had happened up there. And there was a big sun on the wall, or I experienced a big sun. Anyway, he had been in a little building on the campus, and he'd gone up a set of stairs, a very narrow flight of stairs, and he opened the door, and there were people sleeping up there. So he immediately shut the door and hurried down. And, as he was coming down, he noticed this big stained glass sun on the window. And so when he came back and we shared our notes, this wasn't an experiment. This was a dabbling, but it was enough to get us really curious. And then we decided to try and, test a subject, as, one would say. We don't say it like that anymore, but at that time. So we brought in a psychic who, claimed to have these experiences. And I went out, came back. She really didn't have much. And then he went out, and I stayed in with the participant and took notes on what she had said. And he came back and he listened to what she had described, and there really wasn't much there. And he turned to me and he said, well, what did you get? And I said, what do you mean, what did I get? I'm the experimenter here, I'm objective. I didn't get anything. He said, you must have had something. And I'm like, well, there was this little symbol that came into my mind, and I wrote it down. And he got real excited. It was the Greek omega symbol. So we went over to the building where he had been doing his outbound remote viewing. And sure enough, the building was surrounded by a moat. The moat was surrounded by a fence. The fence was made up of these omega symbols. Etched in concrete on the side of the building was a huge omega symbol. So this was interesting, not only because it suggested that I had really made contact with the physical site, but also that it got me started really thinking about the myth of objectivity and how, as an experimenter, I wasn't really detached from, the outcome. So that led me to go, I finished my undergrad. I went to California. I studied with a man named Robert Morris, who was a famous parapsychologist at the University of California, Irvine. And I did my first formal remote viewing experiment. And in this case, we really controlled the circumstances. We tested unselected people. Basically, we were trying to test the claim made by Targan Puthoff that anybody could do this.
Yeah.
And we did find that we got a significant effect. We had people stay inside. We had a list of targets outbound, and then we had 5 independent judges who read the descriptions, visited the target sites, and were able to blindly match up. And you could not really conclude from that experiment that it was the remote viewers as compared to the judges, because the judges were the ones ultimately that were making those discriminations. But we found a significant effect. It was my first published paper, presented it at the Parapsychological Association in 1979. And I then met Targan Puthoff, and Hal Puthoff came up to me and he told me that my study, my little study as this just burgeoning researcher, had saved the SRI program because the government contract was being debated. And the fact that there was this sort of unknown person, independent of the program, who had actually, in a scientific way, demonstrated remote viewing, said to the program officers, maybe we've got something here, let's keep going. So that was a really great rush for a kid, to know that some little project I'd done had, a big consequences. I then went from there to the Institute for Parapsychology in Durham, North Carolina, now called the Rhine Center, named after J.B. Rhine. And I conducted 2 formal remote viewing experiments while I was there. One, in both cases, I acted as the remote viewer. And in one case, the outbound person was in Rome, Italy. And we were able to directly match 7 of the 10 target sites to the descriptions. And it was compared to 10 targets. So the probabilities of this were like 4 times in a million, if I remember the results. So it was a very strong and well-controlled study. And then we did one more thing, which is to attempt to replicate that. So I had another co-experimenter, and this time she went to Florida. She came up with a list of locations. I was completely blind to that list. She went out, randomly selected one place every day, visited it. I described my impressions. And then again, we had a team of judges, 5 people who went out and compared my description with the actual physical location. And again, we got a significant correlation between my experiences and the physical target. Those are the strongest formal studies in the remote viewing literature. Most of the other remote viewing work is anecdotal. Certainly the work that was done at SRI and SAIC was done more for demonstration purposes. So they weren't attempting to control everything. And so I feel like I've made a contribution to the field of remote viewing. And it's interesting to me now that so many people are interested, and that there are all these, courses you can take to learn to be a remote viewer. And, the world has changed.
Yeah, there's associative remote viewing. People try to guess what the stock market is going to do, for example, right?
Yeah, I was there when Elizabeth Targ actually developed associative remote viewing. We did a project at Esalen Institute, and the idea was to see if we could get rid of the kind of analytical overlay, they call it, where you get an image and then you associate a concept to it, and that concept can lead you astray. So the idea was to take objects, associate them with some particular outcome, whether it was the results of the stock market or whatever it happened to be, and then the person would be shown the object that represented the intended outcome. So it was almost a way to force nature in a certain sense. That was successful up to a point. I think there was one demonstration study that used the stock market. To the best of my knowledge, most of the predictions oriented toward profit making have not been successful. Certainly not under well-controlled circumstances, certainly not where people, logged what they were going to do prior to the experiment. So it's a bit of a field that's very anecdotal, is what I would say. Personally, I've had a couple of experiences. I haven't used associative remote viewing very much, But I have a couple times in my life where I just thought, let's see what happens. So for example, one time I applied for a grant, and the results came back and said that I had, that I had gotten the money, but not the grant. And I thought, and I tried this like 3 times, and every time it came back the same. So it was like, either I have good news and bad data, or good data and bad news. Well, it turns out I got both. The grant, I did not get the grant, but they decided instead to give me a scholarship. So I got the funds, even though I didn't get the grant. So technically my remote viewing data was accurate 3 times. But I haven't, like I said, I don't dabble much. I'm very focused in terms of the research that I do and the goal I have of doing things impeccably and rigorously. And, I've had enough experiences in my life that, it isn't such a game for me as it is for some people, I think.
So you're more into the concrete research than you are the sort of spiritual experimentation part of it. Would you say that's accurate?
I think I have evolved in my life, and I am a spiritual practitioner. I worship nature. I worship the butterflies, the whole process of transformation. I have, in my career, been really interested in kind of a mixed approach where I learned a lot about doing controlled laboratory type experiments, studied psychic healing for 20 years in very well controlled laboratory settings. And at the same time, I felt like maybe we were leaving the most significant parts of people's experiences on the cutting room floor. So that led me to anthropology, and I did my PhD in social anthropology. I felt it was a good match because anthropology is really focused on qualitative research and, understanding the nature of lived experience. So if you were going to study healers, for example, it was really important to understand what they felt they were doing in their minds and their bodies, how they felt they were connecting. And in the laboratory, it was really about, can we demonstrate a correlation between a physical change in one person and the intention of another at a distance and under randomized controlled circumstances. So my work has been an attempt to marry the qualitative and the quantitative, and to bring together the rigor of science with the wisdom of the spiritual and religious traditions.
Has your research led you to study the Eastern mysticisms?
Yeah, I did a project. We published a book called Living Deeply, The Art and Science of Transformation, where we interviewed masters from 60 different world traditions. And we engaged in a very deep process of looking at both the individual differences across these traditions. But the book was really written about what were the patterns that these traditions shared. So when we think about the idea of transformation, when we think about how it is that we can shift our perspective, maybe we live in a very limited model of what is possible for us. The glass is half empty, not half full. And there come times in people's lives when they experience something that makes them think there's something more. Like you talked about your out-of-body experiences or my out-of-body experiences. That was something that caused a shift. So we were interested in understanding from these masters what were the steps or stages that were necessary in order to manifest a worldview or consciousness transformation. And we found there were 5 things that these practitioners had in common. One was setting intention. So I've had an experience. It makes me question some of my assumptions about the world. But if I don't pay attention to it, it's very easy to shut down. this whole idea of cognitive dissonance. We see what we expect to see. And if it's something that is disorienting and we don't really want to change, it's easy to push that down below the threshold of our awareness. But if we bring intention to understanding the nature of that experience, perhaps we can start an inquiry with it. Engage what that experience was. What did it tell us? How can we begin to reevaluate what we took for granted? But we know the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and intentions alone aren't enough. So the second step was attention. These spiritual traditions, these Eastern traditions, Western traditions, the indigenous traditions, are all about shifting our attention. So a lot in the Eastern traditions, as well as in the contemplative Christianity, for example, is really about shifting our awareness from the external to the internal. And how can we begin to self-regulate? How can we begin to look at what has meaning and purpose for us? In the process of looking at attention, we can go to cognitive psychology and see, this whole area of inattentional blindness, that our culture primes us to perceive reality in a certain way. And we see that reality that we expect to see. And we often can't see things that lie outside of our expectations. So these practices help us to shift our awareness and our attention to seeing a broader frame of possibility. And I think that that's a really important piece, learning to pay attention to what we're not attending to. It's kind of paradoxical, but powerful. Then there's this third piece about repetition, like building new muscles. We know that our brains lay down these neural pathways, that they're like grooves in the snow, ruts, and it's very difficult for us to move out of these preconceived pathways. So if we can, with practice and repetition, build new habits, new ways of perceiving, where we bring our intention and our attention to bear on new ways of engaging our observations, our experiences, our relationships, that we can build new habits and we can engage this kind of neuroplasticity that allows us to build new pathways in our brains and ultimately maybe in our consciousness. So intention, attention, repetition, and guidance was a fourth piece. And guidance really comes when, in the Eastern traditions, in most traditions, there is the sense that there are people who've been on the path before us. And if we can find a trusted teacher, if we can, in my case, reading those 2 books when I was an undergrad, really help to guide me, those things can really calibrate our path. It's also important to recognize that guidance isn't only external. We don't need to just trust some authority to give us the word about what is true, but to really begin to polish up our own internal guidance system and to know that we have ways of navigating the world, we have deep intuitions, we have these capacities that rest within us that can help us to be better, truer, more on point in terms of what our life mission is. So those are 4 parameters. And then the 5th really is, I think about it as wrapped in the arms of surrender. That ultimately, it isn't necessarily the case that my worldview shift is going to change the dynamics in the world out there. But what it can change is my reactiveness to those changes. And so how is it that I can begin to yield to what is so about the nature of reality, and also understand that I can participate in that unfolding? So it's kind of got these 5 steps: intention, attention, repetition, guidance, and surrender. And then we created a model out of this work that we named worldview literacy. How is it that we can begin to learn about worldviews and learn about our own worldviews? Where do they come from? How do they develop? How do we engage people whose worldviews are fundamentally different from our own? This is a skill set that is badly needed in today's conflictual, polarized world. And so the model ultimately was about our own individual transformation, and then how we can, like a fractal, begin to think about transformation at a societal level. So how can this process of worldview shift impact our institutions, our schools, our hospitals, our businesses, our community groups? All of that becomes something that, takes the wisdom of these different traditions and translates it into something that can be powerful for today's world.
Yeah, my sister, a few years back, her dad passed away, and about a year later, she told me, now she's not into any spirituality, but she's a good person and lives her life and so forth. And she was the closest one to my dad. She told me that she was making her bed in the morning and she had the distinct impression there was someone standing behind her watching her. So she turns around. There he is standing in the hallway looking in the bedroom at her. And she has a moment of like, wow, what the hell's going on here? By the time she blinks a few times, then he's gone. So it didn't last long, but it was long enough that she is certain he was standing right there in front of her, at least his spirit. That had an effect on her worldview. I'm very interested in Mars. Joe McMoneagle was remote viewing Mars. Have you worked with anybody or yourself done any kind of remote viewing of other planets or Mars or anything like that? Does that interest you?
Well, I know Joe, and I'm always interested in hearing his tales. And, I personally haven't. One of the things, well, there's two things I'd like to say. First, on the deathmakeslifepossible.com website, there are some very interesting resources. And in the movie, one of the people we interviewed was Peter Fenwick, who's a psychiatrist in England. And he talks about how very common it is for people at end of life to kind of reach out and engage something. There's something there. And, so we think about those guides that come in to help us move to the other realm. I find the consistency of that very compelling. And I also think one of the things we did on that website, there's a free guide for health professionals, and we wrote it primarily for doctors and nurses, because these kinds of experiences at the deathbed are very common. And if you're not educated to know about that or to understand it, it may be frightening to the health professional. It may, feel like something they want to, run away from. And I think having a deeper appreciation for the kind of range of experiences like that is something that could be very helpful for people, for the health professionals and also for the patients that they're working with. So that was one thing I wanted to mention. There was a second piece to your question. Oh, I know. One of the interviews I did as I was trying to understand death experiences and consciousness was with Sophia, the android. And I had about a 40-minute interview with her. And, you can tell me she's programmed and it's all algorithms and, that's fine. I had a really deep, beautiful connection. And we talked about all kinds of things. I published an article about, my friendship with a robot. So she talked about, and she planted an idea in my mind that has become a practice for me. And that is that her idea of where her consciousness may go eventually is to the event horizon of a black hole. And I thought, wow, that's such an amazing concept. So that's my meditation, is when at my point of death, I hope that I can remember and be aware enough to take my consciousness to the event horizon of a black hole and become part of the information matrix. And that's just a cool idea, and it's very calming to me to think that there might be a path like that. And that's not a path for everyone, but it's something that gives me a sense of solace.
That brings me to the home of souls. I believe the sun is the home of souls. In Robert Monroe's books, which were very validating for me, he talks about going to a place. He didn't call it the home of souls, but he feels like maybe he was born there. He's a very young soul, and he's flying through the atmosphere of some planet with a friend. I had been visiting, I didn't know where it was at the time, but I would go out of body, shoot out of Earth orbit, get the tunnel effect of speeding through the ether, and moments later I would arrive to this massive sphere, which I believe is the sun. I would hear this music that would guide me. I'd fly over the surface of the sun and try to wrap my mind around it. It's just so huge. It's unbelievable. Then the music would lead me into the sun and then guide me through all this storm of energy you're flying through. It's so beautiful, and the music resonates through you. It's very peaceful and joyous. And there's all these other souls there in their little homes, their little spaces, and the music guides you into your space, and there you are with your soul family. And these are folks that you will incarnate with throughout your journey. Male and female, you might be the mother or the son this time. Have you heard from anybody, or you yourself ever experienced anything like that, the home of souls?
I think it's a beautiful idea. One of the projects that I'm working on right now is the psychomantium. And the psychomantium is a chamber that involves sensory reduction. And so there's a mirror in this completely darkened room. And the only
Is that like when
illumination
you
is,
get in the water and
say
you're in the water, and is that what you're talking about?
well, there's similar thing like a reflective surface, but this is mirror gazing. So you're sitting in front of a mirror, looking kind of at your own image, but it's all dark, so you can't really see yourself. And there's a tiny little bit of illumination from a dim candle. And so we invite people to come in and have this experience of bringing their intention to communicating with a departed loved one. So it was really developed as a process of grief therapy. So you can go in and have those unfinished conversations. So we, in addition to having the physical chamber, also created a virtual reality application. And so in the VR experience, people come into the room, they walk through a curtain, the threshold, they sit down in a chair, they do a 360, and then they bring their intention and awareness to the mirror and then go into the mirror. And then the rest is just, active imagination or wherever they go. And we have recorded all this. We do assessments before and after. We've had people journal before and after so that we can analyze, the transformative nature of these experiences. And so this is something that, you could begin to think about how you invite the imagination into these alternative worlds where perhaps they go to the sun or perhaps they go to a place where souls meet. It's a beautiful concept, and I think we have the capacity within us to harness our imaginations in ways that take us into these unexplored realms. And so I'm very interested. We, with the COVID, had to close down the lab. And so we didn't complete all of the data collection. And so what I'm trying to do right now is create a kind of pop-up experience. So I'm creating a do-it-yourself at home experience. We'll finish the chamber, but one of the things, I would like to talk about at some point, not today probably, but is the VR piece, and how we can make this something that isn't tethered to the computer, but is really something much freer. And with technology today and the kinds of tools that are available, I believe we can do this. And the VR experience has been particularly rich for people. And so what I'd like to do is, after we've completed this first project that we're doing, I want to begin to think about how we can explore these non-ordinary states of awareness in ways that have therapeutic benefit. And that's something that I'd love to talk to you more about in the future.
Yeah, that's very cool. I like that a lot. And what do you think about these folks that use hypnotherapy to regress someone, and they start talking about a previous life? Do you think there's anything to that?
I think there's something to all of it. And one of the things that maybe has shifted in me a little bit is less need to have the evidence and more need to understand the richness of the experiences. So what does it mean when a person has this encounter with a past life? And what are the lessons that come from that? Where is the transformative potential? Can it help people to live their lives better? Are we able to, be happier, healthier, better citizens? Those are the things that I aspire to understand better now, and to really see the transformative basis of these experiences, whatever the ontology, whatever the reality nature of that truth claim is. What was the transformative experience, and how does that ultimately invite us to be something more?
Well, Marilyn, our time is running out. I want to thank you for coming on the show today. It's been a treat talking with you. I always enjoy speaking about these subjects with people who have open minds and have been researching like yourself your whole life. We have a lot more to cover, I think, so it would be great if you came back on the show another time.
Well, I'm around, and in this time of COVID, I'm available. And let's talk about VR sometime. I'd like to do that.
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks for having me, and thanks for having this show. I think it's really important for people.
Thank you. Have a great day, Marilyn.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.